나라의 자주적인 평화 통일을 추구하는 질개항의 공동성명이 7월 4일 서울과 평양에서 동시에 발표됐습니다.
한반도뿐 아니라 아시아와 세계의 평화를 위협하는 북한의 핵개발에 대해서도 그 평화적 해결을 위해 대화의 문을 열어놓겠습니다.
We just opened the Korea Global Forum for Peace 2022 with the forum video. I'm sure that many of you were able to get a sense of the purpose and direction for this year's forum and are eagerly anticipating the active discussions and presentations that will take place during the next 3 days. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let us now commence the opening ceremony of the Korea Global Forum for Peace 2022. First, please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Lee Joo-hee, and it is truly a great honor and privilege to be leading you through today's program. First held in 2010 and already marking its 13th anniversary, the Korea Global Forum for Peace is a Track 1.5 multilateral forum hosted by the Ministry of Unification of the Republic of Korea, with the aim of spreading international consensus on peace, stability, and unification of the Korean Peninsula, as well as gathering insight from the leading experts and government officials who joined this forum. Under the theme Vision for Unification of the Korean Peninsula and Inter-Korean Relations in a Transitional Era, this year's forum will seek a new vision for unification and inter-Korean relations, as well as examine the changes that are taking place in the DPRK under the Kim Jong-un regime. The forum will provide a meaningful platform to discuss a vision for a free and democratic unification based on national consensus, as well as Korea's role as a global pivotal state. For the next 3 days, 27 partner institutions from Korea and abroad will join us. Our program this year consists of 3 keynote speeches, 1 special lecture, and 30 sessions. We hope you will join us on our journey to pave the way forward for a peaceful, unified, and prosperous Korean Peninsula. And now to kick off the Korea Global Forum for Peace 2022, it is my honor and pleasure to invite Youngse, the Minister of Unification, to the stage for his opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Minister to the stage with a very warm round of applause.
예, 여러분 반갑습니다.
It's a pleasure to meet you. I am Youngse, Minister of Unification. The Ministry of Unification of the Republic of Korea has the honor of hosting the Korea Global Forum for Peace 2022. I'd like to extend my sincere welcome to all participants. Since its inception in 2010, the KGFP has played a very important role as a venue for global discussions on the issues concerning the Korean Peninsula. As a politician who has long been concerned about issues on the peninsula, I have closely followed the messages delivered at the forum.
새 정부의 통일 대북 정책을
As the Unification Minister in charge of the new administration's unification and North Korea policies, seeing experts on unification and North Korean affairs from around the world today makes me feel various emotions. I hope that today's event will serve as an opportunity to find a new path for the Korean Peninsula and form a consensus among the international community. To congratulate the forum, Secretary General Antonio Guterres of the United Nations sent his congratulatory messages for 2 consecutive years. Thank you very much. I'd like to also thank the speakers today, former Minister of Unification KANG, former Deputy Head of the Federal Chancellery Horst TELTSCHIK, and also the speakers for tomorrow, Professor Juan Enriquez and United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet. My special thanks are with you. I also express my gratitude to the experts who will share their valuable insights, as well as the audience who are interested in Korean Peninsula affairs. In addition, I'd like to express my special gratitude to the members of the organizing committee for their hard work in preparing for the forum. Distinguished guests, amid the accelerating competition for hegemony between the US, China, and Russia, North Korea continues its nuclear development and inter-Korean relations remains strained. The circumstances we're facing certainly isn't easy. In this era of challenge and transformation, the most necessary things for the realization of the vision for unification on the Korean Peninsula and the development of inter-Korean relations are dialogue and action. To turn these challenges into opportunities, the Yoon Suk-yeol administration proposed that creating a virtuous cycle of denuclearization, advancing inter-Korean relations are a must as a Korea's key strategy. And in the President's congratulatory speech on the National Liberation Day, it proposed the audacious initiative. The audacious initiative states that if North Korea makes progress towards denuclearization, the Republic of Korea will provide economic, political, and military support as corresponding measures. And during this process, the 2 Koreas would seek to alleviate military tensions, allow peace to take root, and achieve mutual economic prosperity in a practical manner. The audacious initiative has not only inherited but also evolved and advanced the efforts of the previous administrations and the international community. That is, to induce North Korea's denuclearization and advance inter-Korean relations. The regime security issue raised by North Korea will also be addressed together with the North, based on cooperation between South Korea and the U.S. In addition, if North Korea comes to denuclearization talks with sincerity, we will actively seek to provide bold economic support measures from the initial negotiation process. We have made this very clear. Included in here is a resource food exchange program on the Korean Peninsula, through which North Korea's minerals, sand, rare earth, and other underground resources will be exchanged with massive food supplies. Also included are pilot projects to improve people's livelihoods in the fields of healthcare, drinking water, and forestry. The proposal is also open to engaging in serious discussions regarding any agenda that North Korea has in mind. Once dialogue begins, both sides would be able to candidly talk about their needs, engage in discussions in a practical and flexible manner, and come up with substantive solutions. I am confident that the proposal of the Yoon administration has a realistic possibility higher than that of any other administrations. It is also supported by the strongest will to act. Therefore, all that is needed between the 2 Koreas now are dialogue and action. Nevertheless, North Korea continues to speak ill of our proposal and reject it, which is highly unfortunate. It is not the case that the South Korean government has failed to predict such a response from Pyongyang. We are well aware that the pent-up mistrust cannot be resolved overnight. But I'd like to stress once again that the Yoon administration will be different from any other previous administrations. To be honest, with regards to inter-Korean relations, the conservative governments have been rather tight with making promises, and the progressive governments have lacked the ability to fulfill the promises. The Yoon administration plans to approach inter-Korean relations more flexibly and actively than any other past governments. At the same time, it will secure public consensus and global agreement so as to maximize its competency to put its promise into practice. So long as North Korea shows a change in its current attitude, cooperation with the US and China would become possible so as to draw full support from the international community. I sincerely hope that North Korea would take a serious look at our proposal and engage in a constructive dialogue. Regardless of agenda or occasion, as long as the door to dialogue opens, I am willing to go there as fast as my feet can carry me. Distinguished guests, dialogue and action for the audacious initiative will serve as a foothold for peace on the Korean Peninsula, Northeast Asia, and even the world. It will also serve as a stepping stone for dialogue between South Korea, North Korea, and the US. Based on strong Korea-US alliance, the Yoon administration will not only pursue inter-Korean talks, but also support the resumption of US-North Korea talks. We will seek to develop those talks into trilateral dialogue so as to provide a real space for communication to achieve denuclearization. At a time when strategic competition between the US, China, and Russia is intensifying, creating a cooperative relationship among the three countries through the process of denuclearizing North Korea will provide an excellent opportunity in terms of global peace and co-prosperity of mankind. I also ask the international community to provide unified support so that the two Koreas can enter the stage of dialogue and action. Distinguished guests, for the Korean people who are living on a divided peninsula, peace and unification are our ultimate goals and supreme tasks. The Yoon administration, based on universal values of humanity such as freedom, democracy, peace, and human rights, will promote peaceful unification of the Korean peninsula in a consistent manner. Our determination and capabilities for peace and unification, as well as the support and cooperation of the international community, are the biggest drivers of promoting unification and North Korea policy. Hence, the administration will exert its utmost efforts to lay the foundation for unification at home and abroad. As one way of doing this, the Yoon administration would carry out projects to publicly discuss specific ways to develop and succeed the Korean National Community Unification Formula. The Korean National Community Unification Formula is also our future vision for unification that we present to the international community. Rather than vaguely insisting that Korea ought to be unified, we should be able to clearly present what the unified Korea looks like. In other words, we should present a clear future unification vision. When we are able to show the benefits and contributions that a unified Korea of the future can bring to our neighboring countries and the international community, global support and cooperation for unification will become stronger. To make sure that the formula contains a vision endorsed by the international community, we will also strengthen our public diplomacy for unification, which would include dialogue with the international community. In this regard, this forum is indeed a highly valuable opportunity as we are able to pool our wisdom together on unification issues and engage in related discussions. As we mark the first day of the KGFP 2022 today, I hope that your profound knowledge and insights would allow us to present a milestone leading to the stage of dialogue and action for inter-Korean relations. I also hope that both domestic and global consensus on our vision of unification will disseminate going forward. Once again, thank you for attending the KGFP 2022. I wish you all happiness and health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your meaningful words and also for officially opening this year's forum. Through the minister's speech, we were able to once again understand the new government's policy, including the audacious initiative and also the importance of peace and unification. Well, next, ladies and gentlemen, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, has sent us a special congratulatory video. Why don't we take a look together?
I'm pleased to send my greetings to the Korea Global Forum for Peace. I've just returned from a visit to the Republic of Korea, and I applaud your strong voice for peace and security and for championing multilateralism and cooperation. Dialogue for peace is needed more than ever. Regrettably, we have witnessed disappointing setbacks. The Korean Peninsula remains a potentially dangerous international flashpoint. Nuclear risk around the world has climbed to its highest point in decades. We need all states to recommit to a world free of nuclear weapons and to pursue the path of dialogue to ease tensions and promote peaceful and friendly relations. I urge all parties to foster an atmosphere conducive to advancing sustainable peace and complete and verifiable denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the 4th of July Inter-Korean Joint Statement, which was focused on removing misunderstandings and mitigating heightened tensions. The anniversary is a painful reminder of the lack of peace on the peninsula and the current absence of dialogue between the Koreas. I urge the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to positively respond to the offers to engage in dialogue and for all parties to build on earlier agreements. The United Nations continues to stand ready to support initiatives to bring people together and realize lasting peace on the peninsula. I wish you a productive forum, and I thank you.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, although he is not joining us here in person, please give His Excellency the Secretary General a big round of applause for his special message and inspiring words. Well, with this, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to conclude the opening ceremony of the Korea Global Forum for Peace 2022. Thank you. All right, I think we are ready to begin the program again. We're going to begin the first keynote speech of the Korea Global Forum for Peace 2022. Our first keynote speaker is Kang Deok, the former Minister of Unification. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Kang to the stage with a very warm round of applause.
여러분 안녕하십니까?
Good morning.
지금 소개받은
As introduced, my name is Kang Deok.
오늘 제에게 주신 주최 측에
I would like to thank the forum for inviting me as the keynote speaker.
공동성명의 의의와 함의
And the title of my presentation is The Meaning and Implications of the July 4th Inter-Korean Joint Statement. So I looked back on what happened 50 years ago. The July 4th Inter-Korean Joint Statement was signed in 1972.
오가며 회의를 했던
And
남북조선위원회 멤버
I was one of the members of the committee responsible for the joint statement, and we went back and forth North Korea and South Korea. And we had the director of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, Lee Hura, as well as many other distinguished officers like Choi Kyu-hak and Ah Jung-yeon, and
간사를 담당했던 정부
also
간사.
Mr. Chung Hoon-ji, who was the coordinator, and I myself. So there were a total of 5 people in the coordinating committee who went back and forth North Korea and South Korea for this joint statement. And among them, 4 of them have passed away, and I am the only one who is remaining.
마침사 남북 공동성명 발표 이후에 남북 관계에 대한 증언을
So I think they wanted me to give you a testimony
나를 여기에
about the joint statement, because I'm the only member who is living.
우리의 국제 정세는
At the time, the international political landscape was very volatile.
대로
You probably know already, but in 1969,
기순 doctrine을 발표했습니다.
the President Nelson of the United States declared a doctrine
고려한 점인지
so as to address communist issues.
중국을 방문하던 그런 준비된 그런 시기였습니다.
And it was times when foreign affairs ministers would pay a visit to China, and the Vietnamese War was nearing its end. On the other hand,
하나 1968년에
in 1968, there was a strike in the Korean presidential office by North Korea, and in fall,
120여 명의
there was an incident.
20여 명의 게릴라를 투입해서
There was a guerrilla strike by 120 men troops.
북측의 계획이 실패하던 그런 시기입니다.
Well, actually, the strike itself, for the Ulchi Samcheok incident, ended in a failure. And as you know, in the 1960s, Korea was able to develop its economy based on exports, and we were able to grow into a heavy industry and chemical industry hub. And President Park Chung-hee at this time declared that economy should develop first and unification later. In other words, if you are to establish a relationship like West and East Germany's, then Korea would take a step closer to unification. That's what the president had in mind. So in 1970,
평화 통일 구상이 발표됐습니다.
the initiative for peaceful unification was announced.
우리는 북쪽에게 인도적인
And
문제를 해결하기 위한
to resolve humanitarian issues, we offered a dialogue to North Korea. In 1971,
8월의 일이었습니다. 그러나
August of 1971, we offered a humanitarian dialogue with North Korea.
지진부진했습니다.
but no progress was made.
그래서 남북 간의 정치적 회담으로 옮겨가야 되겠다.
Therefore,
생각으로
with the thought that we should engage in political discussion, our official went to visit North Korea to meet Kim Il-sung,
박성철 부수상이
and also Vice Premier Park Sung-chul of North Korea visited South Korea to meet President Park Chung-hee, and the two reached a consensus. And hence, the July 4th Inter-Korean Joint Statement was signed.
이 성명을 발표하고 할 때 당시에
When the statement was announced,
부장 주동을 했던 이우락 부장이
Director Lee Hoo-rak of the Korea Central Intelligence Agency
대화 없는
said that
대결의 시대로부터 대화 있는 대결의 시대로
we will now transition into an era of confrontation without dialogue to an era of confrontation with dialogue. So the joint statement of July 4th has some
발표했습니다. 첫째로
important elements to it.
평화통일의
First,
3대 원칙을 발표했습니다.
we announced the three principles of peaceful unification.
가자.
We wanted to overcome the ideological differences, and we also wanted to achieve unification through our own independent power. And we wanted to achieve unification not by force but through peaceful means. So these are some of the principles that we announced in the joint statement. And as a director of the Secretary General of the Inter-Korean Dialogue, I did feel some rejection. I did have some rejection to the idea, but because clash and conflict was so often, it often occurred on the Korean Peninsula, that the three principles ought to be the solution for the crisis. And in the joint statement are some important agreements. First is that there should be no armed clashes and also no defamation of each other. And there should also be exchanges in different ways, in many different ways. And also the third one is when there are unexpected incidents, we would establish a hotline so as to communicate with each other. And to resolve inter-Korean issues, we should form a consultative body. So those were some of the agreements made in the joint statement. So amid the 50-year-long dialogue, these principles have been applied with no exception. During the Moon Jae-in administration, we made the Panmunjom Declaration. And in the Roh Moo-hyun administration, we made the November 14th Declaration. And in the Kim Dae-jung administration, we also made the June 15th joint statement. And the principles have all been adhered to. And as much as we would like to completely stick to these declarations and joint statements, unfortunately, that has never been the case. The important principles that we agreed to have not been fulfilled to their full extent. And what could be the reason for that? I have thought about this issue for the past 50 years. There are several reasons, and first of them is because of geopolitical location of the Korean Peninsula and the risk that comes from it and the interference from the neighboring countries. Because of that, those are probably one of the biggest obstacles to us fulfilling these principles. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. In the history of the Korean people, the geopolitical risk have long played an important role in our history. The old Joseon, the Silla, and the Three Kingdom period, when there were three kingdoms of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, are part of our history, but we saw two big incidents after that period. One is in 1951
일본의 도요토미 히데요시가
when Toyotomi Hideyoshi of Japan, 1592, invaded Korea
한반도를 침략했습니다.
to advance into the continents.
그러면 1636년에
And in 1636, about 40 years later,
청국이
the
대륙에서부터 우리 한반도를
from China, the Qing dynasty invaded Korea.
영자 호란입니다.
It's the Manchu War of 1636.
간의 충돌.
So the clash between the continental power and the marine power, Korea was caught in between and had to find ways to survive.
서로 다른 정책을 썼습니다.
And back in the time,
대륙에 대해서는
there were two different policies against the continental power.
종속 관계,
We had a relationship of subordination. In other words, we paid tribute to the continental powers. And with regards to the marine powers,
교린 관계.
we pursued a good neighbor policy. After Toyotomi Hideyoshi passed away and the Tokugawa era took place in in Japan, we exchanged communication envoys 12 times with Japan so as to forge a good neighbor relationship. And for the past 170 years, after that, for the 170 years, Korea was able to maintain peace. However, we entered the 19th century and the peace was disturbed.
영국이
As you know,
유럽, 프랑스, 독일, 네덜란드
the UK, Germany, France, and the Netherlands advanced into Asian countries.
침범하게 됩니다.
And they invaded the
대표적인 사건이
continent of China.
아편 전쟁이었습니다.
And the most representative event of that is the Opium War in the 1840s.
크게 동요합니다.
And so the war for hegemony is now experiencing a great shake. And also Russia was pursuing Go South policy. And against this backdrop, the Korean Peninsula inevitably faced great challenges.
그동안에 북의 양력 1866년에
In 1866,
우리나라는 1840년 이후에
so after 1840,
양력을 맞이합니다.
South Korea meets
사마노, 미국의 사마노가 대동강을
two incidents where the Samona crosses the Taedong River and
조정의 군대에서 소실당하는 흔히 얘기해서 병민 양류입니다.
disappears in the land of South Korea.
함대가
And so
북에 났습니다. 1871년에
in 1871, the France warship invades Ganghwa-do or attacks Ganghwa-do. That's a 실미양변.
명치 유신으로 군대 국가를 지향하게 된 일본이
And also Japan,
전
with its modernization in 1875,
강화도를 공격합니다.
attacks Ganghwa Island as well.
강화도 사건입니다.
It's the Ganghwa-do
그래서
incident.
한국은 우리 조선은 개항할 수밖에 없어서
So Korea had no choice but to open up. So it opens up in 1976.
패권 국가
But the neighboring countries who exerted power over the Korean Peninsula did not just sit idly by.
이모 분란입니다.
So the Imho
중국군과
Bulan happened in 1981.
세력인 중국 청국과
The Qing dynasty of China and Japan actually clashed on the Korean Peninsula.
조선의 개화파들은 우리도
And the enlightenment camp of Korea said that we should also pursue reform like Japan did.
이런 계기로 해서 청국이
And so that led to the Kapsin coup.
해서 일본이 다시 한국에서
And once again,
침범합니다.
Japan and China engages in a clash on the Korean Peninsula, and as a result of that, the Sino-Japan War occurs from 1894 to 95. So there is a direct clash between the continental power and marine power on the Korean Peninsula, and we faced many sacrifices and damages. The Qing dynasty lost to Japan, and China had to give up its hegemony. And after that, Russia advances to south. And in the 1800s, the UK actually seized the Gyeongseong Island of South Korea to block Japan from exerting its power. And then in 1902, Japan and UK enter into an alliance. From 1904 to 1905. And then there is a war between Russia and Japan. So in the end, Russia and China exit out of Korea, and Japan takes control, and therefore Korea was under Japan's colonization. Now, President Roosevelt of the United States endorsed Japan's colonization over Korea, and at the time, the U.S. seized Hawaii and entered the Philippines. And probably the U.S. was very thankful that Japan was able to contain the other continental powers at a time when the United States was also expanding its territory. And afterwards, Korea began fully colonized by the Japanese government until the Second World War is over. And this pattern actually is revived once again after the Korean War is over. So the Soviet Union, after the Korean War breaks out, the Soviet Union backs North Korea and the United States backs Korea, South Korea, and afterwards the 38th parallel is formed to divide the peninsula into two nations. From 1945 to 1950,
한국의 공산주의 집단 김일성의 지배하에 있던 북한에서 고등학교를 다녔습니다.
went to high school in North Korea, and I can vividly still remember the experience that I had there. As you know, the Soviet Union encouraged Kim Il-sung to create a communist country and arm the country and encouraged them to instigate the Korean War. But in the United States, there was President Truman at the time who sent General MacArthur to South Korea to stop the North Korean invasion. And as a result, in 1953, the Armistice Agreement was signed, and that was the beginning of the inter-Korean relations that we are experiencing today. So, in other words, Korea became an artificial island nation because we are not able to go to the northern part of the peninsula. And under the auspices of the United States, based on ROC-US alliance, we were able to create our own prosperity of the nation. And up until the 1970s, South Korea walked on a path of modernization, and we experienced prosperity. On the other hand, under Kim Il-sung's rule and under Stalin or communist system, North Korea went on. And against this backdrop, the July 4th joint statement was signed, and we entered into an era of confrontation with dialogue. Now, we must bear in mind such history of the Korean Peninsula. And We must also bear in mind
얼마나 우리에게 중요한 문제인가.
how important it is for South Korea to engage with its neighboring countries to guarantee our security and to maintain peace on the country when given the geopolitical risks that we are facing. We are maintaining our security based on our alliance with the United States, as well as peace. And this is inevitable for Korea. Now, under such geopolitical conditions, Korea could not help but to walk on this path. And the second thing I would like to talk about today is inter-Korean relations. And this is not an issue that was formed just after Korea's liberation. If you look at Korea's history, you will be able to see that inter-Korean relations or North-South relations has actually been formed since the Three Kingdom period. The northern part of the country did not recognize the unification of Shilo. If you look at the history book from the northern part of the peninsula, you will be able to see that. In the northern part of the peninsula, they did not acknowledge that the Shilla, which was located at the southern part of the peninsula, unified the three countries and created a single nation. If you look at the history book, you will be able to see a map. And the map actually indicates that Shilla is smaller than its unified territory. And the country of Parhe, which was extinguished at the time, still existed in that map. In other words, the northern part of the peninsula did not acknowledge Shilla's unification. So when people of Goguryeo, they advanced north to create Parhe, and the Goguryeo people who came down south created a country called Shilla and struggled for independence. And as a result, there was a post-Baekje, post-Goguryeo, and Shilla, the post-Three Kingdoms. So if you look at the history of the northern part of the peninsula, they don't call it a unified Shilla, but they call it a post-Shilla. So historians of the northern part of the peninsula did not acknowledge the fact that Shilla achieved unification. So in other words, unification is recorded. The unification by Shilla is recorded only in the southern part of the peninsula. And as a matter of fact, the northern part of the peninsula argues that unification was not achieved by Shilla or the Goguryeo people who advanced south, but actually by the Goguryeo people who remained in the north. So I believe that such division has occurred long in Korean history. And in 1948, in the September 9th DPRK Foundation Day, 8 policies were announced, and one of them was unify the territory so as to create a unified, independent state. So looking at that, I thought that perhaps the DPRK is still reminiscing the Goguryeo period. In April 1948, Pyongyang held a congress, and many representatives from South Korea attended that Congress. I was a high schooler back then.
남한에서 오신
And
민족주의 대표자들
Kim Il-sung welcomed Kim Gu,
이런 분들을
Kim Gyu-sik, and other representatives from South Korea
고등학교인 우리
and took them to the only high school in North Korea, which was my school, where I attended.
남한의
So while we were studying at school, Kim Il-sung brought the South Korean delegation and gave them a tour.
동무들 나를 보시오. 가봤습니다.
And he asked us
계시는 분이
to,
유명한
and he told us that
독립투쟁가이신
the people, the South Korean delegation, and the head of the delegation is Kim Gu, who is a famous activist for Korea's independence.
그러한 벽보가 수없이 붙어 있을 때입니다.
And this was at a time when North Korea had slogans written all over the walls about
방에 들어와서 여기에 계시는 분이
overthrowing Kim Gu and overthrowing Lee Seung-man and so on. And nevertheless, the leader of North Korea came to our classroom and introduced Kim Gu to us, saying that he is a famous activist.
림꺽정 소설 읽었습니까?
And he also asked us, did you read the novel 임꺽정?
홍명희 선생입니다.
This person, Hong Myung-hee, over here, is the author of the famous novel 임꺽정. And next to him
발전시키기 위해서 제작시대
is someone who advanced the Hangul alphabet letter of Korea, Lee Geum-ho.
김일성의 생각은
Lee Geum-lo, I'm sorry.
합작해서
And what the North Korea probably had in mind is that by cooperating with South Korea, they will be able to unify the territory.
왜냐하면 인민군대가 창설됐을 때입니다.
And this was back in the days when the North Korean military was already established.
탱크
They had 242 tanks and they had 200,000 people in the military.
대구 폭동, 사선 폭동
And in Korea, there were many uprisings that happened in the country, and everything was a mess.
정부를 수립한 대한민국 정부는
And after the South Korea established its government,
데모가 일어나서 혼돈한 스테이지
faced many riots and uprisings and faced a era of chaos.
이거 내려가면
And Kim Il-sung probably had
더 완전 할수
thought that if they take the situation into their own advantage, they would be able to unify the territory.
에치슨 성명이 발표되고
And the famous Etchison statement was
우리나라를
announced back then,
한국의 밖으로 규정했음을 발표하자.
and the United States declared that South Korea is now out of the U.S.'s defense line. And after this declaration is made, North Korea invades South Korea. This is the history of the Korean Peninsula. In other words, in terms of inter-Korean division, this has happened a long time in history.
1800년대
And
후반에
in the late
영신 이후에
1800s,
협상을 보면은
when we look at the negotiation between Russia and Japan,
완화자
they say that they ought to exchange Manchuria and Korea.
인정하고
So Japan would recognize Russia's rule over Manchuria,
지배를 인정하라.
and Russia would recognize Japan's rule over Korea. If that is not the case, then they should just split the territory based on the 39th parallel.
남북 관계는
And such
이만큼
continued even
오랫동안
after 1945.
분단을
So
시키는 그런 여론이 그런 그 합의가
the two Koreas have experienced separation for a very long time in history. Inter-Korean relations is not an easy issue.
처음 시작된 것이 아니고
And the division in inter-Korean issue is not something new.
문제가 논의될 수는
The issue of division has been in discussion for a very long time if we look at history.
있습니다. 그것은
And there's another risk,
내부에서 일어나게 하는 리스크입니다.
risks that happen within North and South Koreas. Whenever I think about inter-Korean relations,
일치된 단계를 생각합니다.
I always think about a united cohesion within our country.
선점해서 우리 내부를 분열시키던 이런 상태가 일어나서는
We ought to never see
문제를 북쪽과 협의할 수가 없다.
a case where we would lose this internal cohesion or internal unity, or else this will not lead to a peaceful unification. And even with the system of dictatorship and hereditary succession in North Korea,
인간이 사는 사회입니다.
North Korea is a country where there are people or human beings live.
강간, 강도, 도둑질,
You know, thieves, tricksters, and rapists, and so on. All these social issues occur whenever there are people living. So we ought to think about these internal issues in mind when we think about unification.
관계뿐만 아니라 국제 관계뿐만 아니라 남북 내부에서 일어나는 내적 문제.
And therefore, internal affairs, and not just international affairs of North and South Korea, ought to be considered so as to resolve this issue of peace and unification.
리스크를 생각하면서 저는
So with those three risks in mind,
김정은 정권이 하고 있는 핵 문제,
I would like to address the nuclear issue.
남북한의 문제는 해결.
If the nuclear issue is not resolved, then inter-Korean issue will never be resolved. North Korea's nuclear development program is a threat to South Korea. We are trying to, or we hope to, address this issue under the nuclear umbrella of the United States. If the nuclear umbrella alone is not enough to resolve this denuclearization issue, we would hope that the United States would provide an even stronger nuclear umbrella, even with the involvement of the NATO. Or else the North Korean denuclearization issue will remain unresolved and threatening.
확산 억지 전략 이것 가지고 북쪽의 핵을 막을 수 있을까?
So will our non-proliferation or proliferation deterrence strategy be enough? But at a time when the power balance is breaking, is the current system enough? That's what I'm concerned about.
따라서 우리도 북쪽이 갖고 있는 핵에 대응할 수 있는
And so, in order to respond to North Korea's nuclear program, having an asymmetrical strategy or weapons of our own might be the only solution to the problem. Some people say that maybe South Korea should be armed with nuclear weapons, but if that is the case, we would face many limitations. That's not a feasible option. In that case, the nuclear umbrella of the United States would have to be one that is more trustworthy and reliable. Whenever there are troubles to the strategic assets, whenever there are troubles on the Korean Peninsula, the strategic assets of the United States would come to curb or contain North Korea's armed protest. And also, once again, I would like to stress that we ought to consider having asymmetrical weapons of our own. I go to the RFA radio program at least once a week to deliver, to take part in a segment called Message to North Korean Officials. And if we look at the internal affairs of North Korea, and the psychological radio broadcasting that we send to the North Korean people might play some positive roles in influencing the North Korean people. However, in the Moon Jae-in administration, we seized the psychological warfare against North Korea, so I was not able to do anything. You probably remember that 2 to 3 years ago, Kim Jong-un was enraged that the North Korean defectors are sending leaflets to North Korea, and it blew up the liaison office in Kaesong Industrial Complex. And I believe that such leaflets and so on could be an asymmetric weapons of ours. while we put stronger sanctions against North Korea, we should use all means possible to convey our messages to people in North Korea.
동시에 우리 내부도
At the same time,
시켜서
we would also have to stabilize the internal affairs of South Korea.
인권, 법치, 시장을
Liberal democracy, our democratic rules, human rights, and other universal human values that we uphold today should be the basis of our response against North Korea.
저는 이번에 출범한
And against this backdrop,
아까 권영세 장관께서 말씀하신
as Minister Kwon Youngse has said, I believe that the Yoon administration
그리고 융통성이 있는
is very flexible.
내놓고
It has presented many flexible and effective
물론
measures, and it ought to do more so in the future. I know that this is a very difficult task,
이러한 북적을 설득시키고
but we should be able to make more efforts to persuade North Korea and denuclearize the state and pursue peaceful unification. That's the task that is given to us.
여러분이 여러 섹션에서
And I hope that
깊이 토해 주실 것을 부탁드립니다.
you will engage in in-depth discussions about this very issue in the different sections that you are taking part in. So thank you for listening to a very long message from a very old man who is 90 years old. But I do understand that there are generational differences. You are living in a digital era. You are part of the digital generation. And
늘다 고려하고 있습니다.
you know how to use more advanced means than I do. So let me give you an example.
1972년에
In 1972, when Inter-Korean dialogue began,
대표가 첫 번째
representatives from North and South Korea agreed that they would not defame each other or criticize each other. So they say that we should stop all
우리는 KBS
critical
모든 방송국에
broadcast to North Korea. So in KBS, the broadcasting system of Korea, they seized all sort of critical programs that went out to North Korea. But 1 month later, while South Korea completely suspended those programs, North Korea still continued with one of its programs.
남북의 북쪽의 대남공작의 핵심 기구인 통일전선부에서 운영하고
The United Front Department had what it called the Unification Revolution Party's Voice program, and that was not suspended by North Korea. So
제2차 남북조절위원회 장소에서 그 문제를 제기했습니다.
I actually raised this issue with the North Korean officials during a meeting,
남북 간에
saying that
했는데
we agree to suspend such programs, but you are continuing with one of the program.
라고 지적했더니
So when I raised this issue,
북쪽 대표가
the North Korean
가관이었습니다.
delegation gave me a very interesting answer. Well, that isn't that the anti-regime broadcast that you're doing?
이런 엉뚱한 대답을 해왔습니다.
So I asked them a question, or I raised an issue, and they gave me a completely unexpected answer. And they took out a map and say, this Haeju area.
이거다. 왜 거짓말을 하냐?
So this broadcast is actually being broadcasted in a territory that belongs to South Korea. So if you continue doing this, we will also resume one of our programs.
부장님,
So I
부장님께 북쪽의
took this answer back to the government,
대항할 수 있는 우리 수단을 다 갖고 있습니다.
and I said,
북쪽이
we have all means possible to respond to North Korea's provocations. If North Korea does not seize all of its programs, that we shouldn't do so as well. So I told them that we should do everything that North Korea should do. In other words, we cannot trust the promises made by North Korea. We should be strategic in our thinking.
하나 예를 들겠습니다.
And I would like to give you one more example.
87, 8년의 일입니다.
It was back in
현대 정주영 회장은
1988.
평양에 갔다 왔습니다.
The Chung Ju-young, president of Hyundai, went to North Korea secretly, and
이런 소리를 했습니다. 1박 원산에 갔더니
And I went with them, and they told me that when I went to Wonsan,
무슨 말씀?
the North Korean people said that in Wonsan, the monies are flying everywhere, they're rolling everywhere. So I said, what do you mean? And they said that
완전히 풀밭으로
the beautiful beach in Wonsan has turned into a grass area.
이틀 동안 밀면 깨끗하게 옛날에
If you just take a bulldozer and
그래서요.
rip all those grass apart, you will be able to see that beautiful beach again.
뒤에다가 설치하고 여름에
So,
남한에 해수욕 원하는 사람들을 배에 싣고 원산에 데리고 가서 입장료를 받고
so they
원산
asked that we install containers and also invite people to
1인당 100불씩
enjoy the
받아도
beach.
갈 거다.
And even if we collect admission fee of $100 per person, people will still be willing to come.
이거 이런 식으로 북쪽과 좀 협의하면 좋겠다.
So that's the kind of proposal or a joke that North Korea made.
저는 역시 현대라는 대기업을 운영하고 있는 정주영 회장의
So Chairman Chung Ju-young.
느꼈습니다. 특히 저는 통일부 장관 할 때
Sorry, so this was a proposal by Chairman Chung Ju-young made to North Korea, and I thought he is indeed a clever entrepreneur.
휴전선을 넘어갔습니다. 저는 그때 정주영
And-
회장이 설목을 앞장서서 가는 그런 것을 쭉 보면서 참
And President Chung Ju-young also took a cow when he went over to North Korea, and I thought he was indeed a clever man.
어느 나라에서 생방송을 하고 있다.
So and this visit was
100개 이상의 나라에서
live broadcasted
그러면
in various TV stations all across the world.
아니 그건 아니고
And even just 5 to 10 minute live broadcast, or even just a few minutes of broadcast, really has a great advertisement effect.
이껏 해봐야
So the price of
50만 달러밖에 더 되겠느냐? 그런데
1,000 cows
전 세계에
is not so much when you think about the advertising effect of this live broadcast.
100만 달러 되지 않겠느냐?
So this would have a great advertising effect for Hyundai. So once again, Chairman Chung Ju-young is indeed a clever man.
우리도 전략적 사고로
So we should also be strategic in our thinking when we think about how to improve inter-Korean relations.
오늘이라고 생각합니다.
And I believe that we will be able to come up with those strategic thinking here
여러 가지
today.
안들을 담대한 대북 제안들을 내놨습니다.
So the Yoon administration presented audacious initiative to North Korea, and it's up to North Korea for that initiative to be realized. For North Korea to come to the table for talks
핵 문제를 해결할 수 있는 길로 나올 수밖에 없도록
and to induce North Korea to walk on a path of denuclearization, we ought to make
밀고 나갈 수 있는 어프로치
efforts not here in South Korea, but also together with the international community. And I hope that today's forum will become a starting point for that. So with that, I would like to conclude my message. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give Mr. Kang In-deok, the former Minister of Unification, another big round of applause. Thank you so much for sharing with us your personal experiences as well as your deep insight. I think that many of our participants were able to understand the broader historical context to understanding what's happening here on the Korean Peninsula. Well, our next keynote speaker joins us from Germany, Mr. Horst TELTSCHIK, the former deputy head of the Federal Chancellery, is joining us online. Let's see if he is connected. Mr. TELTSCHIK, hello.
Hey,
Can you hear us?
hello, good morning.
Good morning.
I can hear you.
All right, then you may begin your keynote speech. Thank you.
Fine, thank you. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thanks for inviting me to your Korea Global Forum for Peace 2022. I'm really sorry that I cannot be with you in Seoul today. The name of the reason is Corona. Despite of already 4 vaccinations, I was asked by the airline for further PCR testing, which I could not manage on short notice on the Munich airport. Nevertheless, it is a great honor for me to address you via Zoom. It is a great privilege as well for me, but at the very same time, not an easy understanding to address your important conference discussing peace, stability, and the reunification of the Korean Peninsula, watching at the very same time the horrors of the Russian war in the Ukraine, the growing tensions in your area, the ongoing struggle between the big powers to shape a new world order, facing once again a growing fight between democratic societies and imperialistic power politics. And at the very same time being confronted with global challenges threatening all our societies, whether it is a change in climate or new pandemics, or the growing efforts of more and more states to develop new nuclear systems and to nuclearize even the universe. The new nuclear systems are faster, flying at 5 times the speed of current systems, equipped with smaller nuclear warheads with limited explosive effect. Therefore, the temptation using them might grow. Just now, some observers are already afraid that President Putin might be tempted doing it to end the war in the Ukraine and to prevent a defeat of his troops. That would be indeed a nightmare. In your letter inviting me to this conference, you reminded me that this year marks the 30th anniversary of diplomatic ties between the Republic of Korea and the People's Republic of China. Well, this was one of the topics Chancellor Helmut Kohl had discussed more than 30 years ago with your Prime Minister at the time, and at his request with the Chinese counterparts in Beijing. After these meetings, Chancellor Kohl had asked me to follow his initiative, and I did. Over the years, I could witness how fast and successful the relations between your country and China had improved, mainly economically and surprisingly culturally as well, referring to the Korean culture of modern pop music, which was very popular in China. When Chancellor Helmut Kohl came into office, October 1st, 1982, his government was facing a very critical stage concerning the relation between NATO and the Soviet Union. For the time being, it was the end of the policy of détente between East and West, having started after the Cuban and Berlin crisis from 1958 to 1960. It was the American President John F. Kennedy with his famous speech on peace in 1961, even published in all Soviet newspapers, followed by NATO's Hamel report from December 1967, formulating NATO's détente policy. I quote, "Security and détente are the two sides of the same medallion." 9 months later, in August 1968, the Soviet army suppressed the so-called Spring of Prague, a peaceful demonstration of people in favor of more liberty and human rights. Soviet tanks crushed a peaceful revolt. Nevertheless, half a year later, the German Chancellor Willy Brandt reminded the public about a former Soviet proposal of an all-European peace and security order. Parallel to this multilateral initiative, the German government initiated bilateral agreements with the Soviet Union, with Poland, the Czech Republic, and even with the GDR, agreeing on the political and territorial status quo in Europe and of the status of Berlin. Chancellor Willy Brandt developed at that time a close chemistry with the Soviet Secretary General Brezhnev. Traveling together to the Krim Island, went boating and swimming together. The highlight of all these East-West efforts to strengthen détente and cooperation was the CSCE Conference on Security and Cooperation on August 1st, 1975 in Helsinki, where all 35 heads of government signed the final act of the CSCE conference. The common assessment of all participants has been the final act is an historic breakthrough and a highlight in the Cold War, recognizing the significance of human rights and the basic liberty rights. The participants agreed on 3 so-called baskets. First, confidence-building measures in the area of security and disarmament. Second, cooperation in economy, science, technique, and environment. Third, cooperation in humanitarian and other areas. This Helsinki final act was celebrated by the West and the East as the beginning of a far-reaching policy of détente and cooperation. But shortly afterwards, the West had to realize that Secretary General Brezhnev had started a new arms race by developing and deploying nuclear intermediate-range ballistic missiles, the so-called SS-20. Due to their range, they were not aimed at their chief opponent, the United States, but rather at those European NATO partners who, like the German Chancellor Willy Brandt, had been the most determined supporter of the détente policy between East and West. In response to the Soviet arms buildup of nuclear intermediate-range ballistic missiles, the so-called SS-20, the Atlantic Alliance had passed a double resolution in December 1979 initiated by the German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, the Social Democrats. If the Soviet Union did not dismantle their missiles, NATO would deploy American intermediate-range missiles in Western Europe. At the same time, President Ronald Reagan had announced Star War, the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, in the spring of 1983. However, the Geneva disarmament negotiations between the two world powers failed. Subsequently, the Soviet General Secretary Yuri Andropov threatened NATO with a third world war if the European NATO members would deploy American intermediate-range ballistic missiles, the Pershing II, in Europe. Mass demonstrations followed, especially in West Germany. In Bonn, for example, which was the capital then, and in many other places across Germany, over 500,000 citizens demonstrated against the government of Chancellor Kohl and Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who had been newly elected on October 1st, 1982. Today we know that the Secret Service of the Communist German Democratic Republic supplied organizational and financial support to those responsible for the demonstrations. West Germany received substantial support from the French President François Mitterrand, who advocated strongly for the implementation of the NATO double-track decision in a speech to the German parliament in January 1983. This collective steadfastness and determination of the NATO members paid off. President Mikhail Gorbachev, who back then was only a member of the Politburo of the CPSU, the highest governing body of the USSR, he told me once that two decisions in the West had led to a shift in thinking in the Politburo. First, the double-track decision of NATO. The Soviet leadership had been aware that they couldn't financially afford another arms race. Second, President Reagan's decision to start with SDI, with the Strategic Defense Initiative. Moscow didn't see itself as being up to that technological challenge from the United States. Therefore, summit diplomacy, as well as disarmament and arms control negotiations between the two superpowers, started again in 1985, when Gorbachev was in charge as Secretary General and continued seamlessly with President George Bush. The lessons we have learned at that time. First, security was and is the most important topic in international affairs. In May 1989, President Bush gave an important speech in Germany, publicly announcing, I quote, "The Soviets should know that the US don't aim to undermine their legitimate security interests." That was indeed a fundamental statement at a political crucial moment. Another lesson we learned: take care of your own security first by yourself, and then as member of the Alliance and the European Union as well. Third, don't ask our American friends what you should do, but tell them what you are willing to do and what initiatives you expect from them. Mutual information and trust are essential. When President Bush was re-elected, Chancellor Merkel immediately went to Washington, signing with President Reagan a communique in which he agreed to meet with Secretary General Gorbachev on whatever occasion as soon as possible. The European room of maneuver heavily depended on any progress between both world powers. Fourth, security and an offensive policy of detente remain the two sides of the same medal. Fifth, take all your counterparts and their security concerns seriously, whether you like them or not, dealing with all of them at eye level. It was a great mistake of the American President Obama publicly describing Russia of today as a regional power. And last, provide incentives, whether economic or financial incentives, even food supply or anything else, to improve the chemistry with the communist countries. What's about Korea? Since the early 90s, I have had many opportunities to come to your country for political reasons, having had many bilateral discussions with several members of your government. I'm still a member of the German-Korean Advisory Group, meanwhile for nearly 20 years. As a member of the BMW management board, I had to take care of our Korean business. For quite some years, I tried hard to establish a German-Korean technical university, but unfortunately we failed because of different reasons. On your island, Jeju, I took part in international conferences, once discussing the idea whether Korea could try to establish an international conference in Northern Asia, similar to the CSCE conference in Europe, including China. Once I was moderating a confidential meeting between members of the North Korean Foreign Office and members of American think tanks in Germany. Now I'm speaking to you not as an advisor, but as a friend. Democrats have to stick together more than ever. Turmoils in your region will affect us all, and vice versa. Germany and all the other Europeans are not interested in a confrontation with China. And so far, is China not supporting Russia's war against Ukraine? Nevertheless, there is a common interest. Where is China going? Our globe is facing so many problems, and no country can settle them just by itself. Let us remain as friends. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. TELTSCHIK. Ladies and gentlemen, please give Mr. TELTSCHIK another big round of applause for his insightful keynote speech. And thank you, sir, for sharing lessons from the European experience. I'm sure it has many implications for those of us here in Korea. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our two keynote speakers. Once again, I think they have eloquently set the stage for the following discussions and presentations. And now we are going to take a break, and the parallel session will begin at 11 a.m. The parallel sessions will take place in 4 different venues. Here you can see information about the parallel sessions on the screen. Session 1-1 will take place in Grand Ballroom A and B. Session 1-2 will begin in Grand Ballroom C, Session 1-3 in Junior Ballroom, and Session 1-4 in Room Coral. Also, we are going to divide this venue into 2 different rooms, so please exit the venue for a while, and we also like to ask you to take all of your belongings. So we will begin the parallel session at 11, and we would like to see you back here again.
다시 한번 뵙도록